attending this lecture. And I just wanted to introduce the lecture briefly, and then we'll switch across to the slides, and then we'll come back for questions at the end. So I'm a professor at the University of Bristol. I've been studying dinosaurs and other questions in paleontology for a number of years. And I thought I'd just say hello in person before we switch over to the slides. The main intention of what I want to talk about today is how do we know what we think we know? Or you might say, how do we think we know what we say that we think we know? In other words, the way that the study of dinosaurs is moving fast, the way we do things, the methods we use, which enable us in certain cases, I hope I can convince you, to give answers that we're pretty confident about. So let's switch over to the slides. I'll share screen and we will, here we go. Okay, so what I'm talking about just now is in a book that I wrote a year or so ago, and it's been published in hardback and paperback, The Dinosaurs Rediscovered. And the subtitle is really the subtitle of my talk, How a Scientific Revolution is Rewriting History, or Paleontology in particular. And I came to think about this a little bit when I reviewed the variety of aspects of paleobiology, aspects of dinosaurs that we might be interested in, such as color, feeding, locomotion, birth and growing up, etc., etc. And I realized that these are topics that have interested people for a very long time, and yet key new concepts, key new understandings have really come quite recently. And I don't intend to read through all of these, but these are just examples of the kinds of facts that we would say about dinosaurs now. So toggling between the two, color, we would say dinosaurs had feathers with patterns of colorful stripes and blobs. That's not something that we would have said a few years ago because we didn't know that. Feeding, TRex had a bite force 10 times more powerful than the biggest biter today, the great white shark. How do we know that? Is that purely speculation or what? And we go through each of these themes of the dinosaurs and how they lived. And there are facts or statements under each of those, which again, I don't propose to read through, but each of these statements are the kinds of things that you would find in a textbook or in a book about dinosaurs, and which I think we would say, well, there's a backstory here, there's evidence. And the second key thing about all of these facts is that they're quite recent. So they're all from this century, and some of them even 2018, and currently further information becoming available. So this led me to think a little bit more about what we're doing as paleontologists and how we transmit this information both to other scientists and, of course, more widely to the public. So here's the book, and in the book I step through essentially those 10 areas that I highlighted. And the question I'm asking can be shown in photographs. How do we get from the bones? This is a familiar kind of scene. This is obviously in the American Midwest, where somebody's excavating a dinosaur skeleton. You can see a huge rib here, further ribs and bits of the backbone, etc., etc. How do we get from this, a field of bones, to this, a skeleton in the museum, Allosaurus? So I think most people would understand that you excavate the bones, you string them together, you clean them up, you have some understanding of which bone is which, the left femur, the right femur, etc., etc. But then how do you get from that skeleton to this? Because this wonderful painting by Bob Niccol shows a scene at that time with a theropod, Ceratosaurus as it happens, and a Stegosaurus. They're standing in a particular way, they're behaving in a particular way, they have particular reconstruction of the soft parts, even the colors, all those different features. Is that all guesswork, or what do we think we know, and how could we argue the case? And this makes us think a little bit, of course, about what is science, because often in a simplistic way, we might think, well, of course, paleontology isn't really a science, not like physics and chemistry, where we can test hypotheses, we can do experiments. And here are two images of a scientist, of course, a calm and sensible person and a slightly crazy looking person. And we might say, oh, well, paleontology is what's often called a historical science. We can't go out and repeat experiments. You don't have a time machine to take you back to the Upper Jurassic to try and understand what that scene might have been like. If we did have a time machine, we could probably then say once and for all, yes, that's quite accurate, or actually, no, we've got it all wrong. These dinosaurs were all purple and covered in yellow spots or something like that. So we can't repeat experiments. We can't actually see it. So what can we do? Well, obviously, as a start, we can look at the fossils. So let's do that. And we have to remind ourselves that some fossils are spectacularly amazing. The dinosaur skeleton and the majority of fossils we find on the Jurassic coast are the normal kinds of fossils. But we have to remind ourselves there are exceptional fossils, such as the ant in amber, which can show microscopically fine details, the beetle in an oil shale, which can actually show that some of the original structural color of the elytra here on the back of the beetle, or the fossil mammal here from the Messel Formation in Germany, which is showing hair and traces of internal organs. So we mustn't forget that the raw data can actually tell us a great deal. Fossils can preserve a huge amount of unexpected information. And here's perhaps one of the most unexpected. This is the famous dinosaur in amber. If you were trying to imagine what would be the most fabulous fossil that you could find, maybe the dinosaur in amber would be quite high up there on your list. Needless to say, of course, in amber, you always find ants, whatever kind of deposit. It's full of ants. Here they are. That gives you an idea of the scale. These are about 1/2 inch, 1 centimeter in length. Here is the dinosaur tail. And we know what it is. First of all, it's covered in long whiskery feathers. Here are the feathers closer up. You can see their feathers because they have a middle quill and they have barbs at the side that are branching, just more or less like a modern feather. And doubtless this dinosaur would have preened its feathers to keep the barbs free of junk and to keep them clean. And we know in great detail what's there because we were able to X-ray the specimen. And even though the piece of amber would just fit in the palm of your hand, it's not very huge, it's a small dinosaur. Nonetheless, the X-ray scan shows the 3D structure of the bones of the tail, and indeed the skin and the muscles and other parts of the tail. You know, there's a lot of information available in the fossils. And sometimes new fossils can change our viewpoint. So, for example, some of the older members of the audience will be familiar with this statement that for a long time, we knew the fossils of Archaeopteryx. This is the very famous fossil bird from Germany. It's dated at about 150 million years old from the uppermost Jurassic. The fossils are fabulous. This is just one of the specimens. There are 10 or 12 of them. And they allowed they allowed paleontologists to reconstruct a lot of information about the origin of birds. But it was on its own. And this marked the origin of feathers. Note that date, 150 million years ago, that was it. We couldn't really speculate that feathers had occurred earlier than that. Almost certainly we knew they had, because the feathers in Archaeopteryx are quite advanced, they're quite specialized. There are different kinds of feathers in different parts of the body, but we couldn't really push that much further. And then, of course, since then, most people know in the last 20 years, the most amazing array of fossils have been found, particularly in China. Thousands and thousands of fossils of early birds and of dinosaurs with feathers, including amazing things like this feathered dinosaur, which is Microraptor. In many details, it looks very like Archaeopteryx, but it clearly is a dinosaur. It's lower in the evolutionary tree. And in reconstruction, Microraptor unexpectedly turns out to have 4 wings, not 2. So the fossils are filling gaps, but they're also giving us unexpected new information. And then, even more unexpected, a few years ago, we were involved in a project with Pascal Godefroy, based in Belgium, to study some fossils from Russia, which turned out to be a new dinosaur called Colindrodromaeus. And this dinosaur, which is quite a small creature, 1 meter or so in length, turned out to be most beautifully preserved with fantastic amounts of information on the skin and feathers. We didn't expect feathers, we expected scales. And the reconstruction shows that it had a very much armored, scaly tail, scaly legs, and all kinds of feathers all over the body, but not a hint of a flight feather. So unlike Microraptor, of course, this thing was not a flyer. And the feathers in detail are somewhat different from those of birds and certain dinosaurs. But also, Psittacosaurus was already known with these very strange structures along the backbone. So we knew, as a result of these two discoveries, one in China, one in Russia, that Ornithischian dinosaurs had feathers. And for those of you who know the family tree of dinosaurs, you will know that this is a long way from birds. And then more recently, we've been looking at pterosaurs. And of course, pterosaurs are not dinosaurs at all. They're the cousins of dinosaurs. And people had known for a long time that that pterosaurs have some kind of whiskery covering. And even in this very old reconstruction, they're shown a bit like bats, and people understood they had some kind of insulation. And these were the smaller ones, but even the giants are assumed. Even Quetzalcoatlus, this huge animal here in this beautiful drawing by Mark Whitten, is shown with some sort of whiskery covering. And here, of course, the feathers may be on the wing, but they're not contributing to the aerodynamic properties. They're just there to insulate the body, because presumably as flying animals, these had to have a high metabolic rate. And then last year, working with colleagues in China, we were privileged to be studying a remarkably well-preserved Middle Jurassic pterosaur, quite a small one, just about the size of a pigeon. And in the close study by Zixiao Yang, who was a student then, he's recently been studying in Bristol, we found plenty of examples of the kinds of whiskery things we expected, which are just single strands like this. But then he found others that had different kinds of branching. So for example, some had a tuft at the end, some had a tuft halfway along, some branch from the base. And so if these are tufted and if they're branching, by definition, they're feathers. And so we call them feathers, which certainly put the cat among the pigeons, you might say, or the cat among the whiskery pterosaurs. Are they feathers? Are they not? Well, whatever we call them, there's something to do with, they definitely are part of an insulating coverage. Here is a reconstruction that we had done at the time, showing this happy little pterosaur. It attracted a huge amount of attention, and it turns out everything's got feathers. And so in the family tree, we've got dinosaurs, we've got various other groups, we've got pterosaurs. And so do we now say they've all got feathers? Well, you can split hairs and call them what you like. But the fact is, it seems that the origin of feather-like structures, protofeathers, whatever you want to call them, goes much deeper in time than we had thought. So this has happened in the last 20 years, thanks to discoveries mainly in China, but not just in China. So to remind you, Archaeopteryx is here at about 150 million years ago. And that's the origin of birds, the origins of flight, the origins of those kinds of feathers that we knew in Archaeopteryx. But the Chinese fossils were showing us that feathers go deeper and deeper than we had thought, probably back into the Triassic. And they've been found in ornithischians over here, so this brings them back to the origin of dinosaurs. Now we're reporting them in pterosaurs. So again, whatever you call them, protofeathers, feathers, whiskers, it doesn't matter. The origin is dating right back here. And look at that, it's moved back 100 million years. So the origin of feathers, or whatever we call them, in the dinosaurs and birds and that whole group has moved back 100 million years. It's a whole different time in the history of the Earth. Any kind of understanding of why feathers originated has got to do with body temperature, temperature control, insulation. At that point, nothing to do with flight. So that's a whole change in opinion, if you like, or a whole change in understanding, thanks to new fossil discoveries. But that's not enough. We want to understand other things about dinosaurs. They were huge. How can we understand answering a question like that? Why did dinosaurs get to be so huge? Finding fossils doesn't necessarily answer that question. It doesn't tell us why they were huge. And of course, some of you know that different people have speculated different things, such as, oh, well, they could get to be so huge because gravity was less in the Jurassic than it is today. No, you can't say that. Or secondly, other people have said, oh, well, they're so huge because they spent most of their time in water, just kind of floating around. And therefore you can weigh a huge amount, but if you're floating about in water, then that saves you the trouble of supporting your body mass. No, you can't say that. You have to have evidence. You can't just make wild guesses and say, oh, the world of the dinosaurs was different, therefore they got away with different things. We know for a fact that gravity was not less because the Earth was essentially the same size, therefore gravity must have been the same. Secondly, we know that dinosaurs didn't live underwater all the time because even the giant ones made footprints on dry land. They were walking on dry land. They were not staggering about under the water. So in this case, this rather complex looking diagram is the result of fantastic work by a team of researchers in Germany, Martin Sander and his colleagues. And I put his name here, and Jim Robbins, who's an artist based in Bath, has provided these fantastic pencil drawings. And what Sander has done here is this is the most complex diagram I'm going to show. He has woven together in this kind of flow chart a whole series of observations that we can make about the giant sauropods, each of which can be tested in one way or another. And so I'm not going to try and talk you through this whole diagram at the moment. I'm just going to draw attention to a couple of points. And these are efficient respiration, avian-style lung, and many small offspring. So the secret was, these sauropods, creatures like Brachiosaurus here, could weigh 50 tons, even more, depending on who you read. Whereas remember, an elephant, a large male elephant, is maybe only 5 tons. So it's often said, and quite correctly, that dinosaurs were living life at an order of magnitude larger than the largest mammals. So 10 times, not 5 tons, but 50 tons. The smart thing was that the 50-ton dinosaur essentially only needed to eat as much as a 5-ton elephant. Now, how can that be? The reason is that elephants are stuck with essentially a rather inefficient metabolic system, because 9/10 of what an elephant eats, and in fact 9/10 of what we eat, is not for general maintenance of the body and growth and renewal of cells and all the other stuff that the food has to serve. 9/10 of what we eat, 9/10 of what a cow eats or what an elephant eats, more or less, is for maintaining a constant body temperature, what we call being warm-blooded. It enables us to maintain a constant body temperature, whether it's a cold day or a hot day. Likewise for elephants, but of course elephants live generally in hot countries, so a lot of that effort is wasted, and African elephants flap their great big ears to lose heat, and so they're not that efficient. Whereas a large dinosaur happened to be living in a world that was rather warm all over. So that is one difference with the Jurassic and the present day. There were no ice caps, so the large dinosaurs could wander quite freely all over the world. And they didn't need to eat huge amounts to fuel those internal furnaces. They were maintaining constant body temperature, eating as much as an elephant each day, whatever that happens to be. I can't remember, 1/4 of a ton of food, something like that. They were eating the same amount of food each day, the same amount of fodder, but it was fueling a body that was 10 times the size. Now that's pretty nifty. And the reason we know that is that people have calculated the calorific value of all the different plants that were available to dinosaurs. They've done experiments on feeding elephants and rhinos and so on in zoos. What do they need to eat each day? How much? Can we feed them different kinds of fodder? All that stuff. The other smart thing that the giant dinosaurs did was they didn't carry their young inside the body. They laid eggs. And so Mama Brachiosaurus would lay a clutch of maybe 10 or 20 eggs, and probably she just walked away and left them. And that is more or less what reptiles do today, and indeed most fishes. They tend to just lay the eggs and pretty much just leave them. We're aware of the terrible death toll on the young, of course. We've all seen those evocative pictures of baby turtles hatching out on the beach and staggering about, and half of them get caught by skuas and gulls before they get down to the water. But as long as half of them get down to the water, then already they're winning. because mama turtle has maybe laid 50 or 100 eggs. So only 1 or 2 of them have to survive in the end. And indeed, that's what the sauropods did. So they were saving energy massively. If you look into the business of live birth in elephants and even mating and the production of the young, mother elephant has to carry the one baby. Normally they're just a single baby for 2 years. Pregnancy is 2 years. My God, that's a risk in the wild. Can you survive for 2 years feeding yourself and this baby, which has to get to be quite big before it can be born? Just think about the distance it has to get from mama down to the ground, and then it's got to be able to keep up with the herd. So there's no point the baby elephant being born the size of a rabbit. It's got to be pretty big when it's born so that it can more or less jump up and run, and so on. So all sorts of reasoning behind our understanding of how a dinosaur could be 10 times the size of a mammal. Let's press on. Now, a number of years ago, we made a discovery, and I'm going to talk you through the color of dinosaurs, because this is one of the toughest topics where we need to be quite careful about each step of the argument to be sure that we're providing evidence. So all the way through this argument, I'm going to be using the word evidence. So we're beginning to build a concept that we have fossils, but that we can use those fossils to provide evidence. The rather complex diagram I just showed you of how dinosaurs could be huge, I'm going to talk more about certain parts of that and show that we have evidence. So there were a couple of papers published in the year 2010 describing the color of 2 dinosaurs. This was R1, ginger colored with a stripy tail. This was the other one, which came from another team based, this is based in China and at the University of Bristol. This team was based at Yale University in the United States, and again, several institutions in China. And their dinosaur is black and white with a lovely gingery crest. And of course, this attracted a lot of attention. And how did we have the courage to go ahead and say this? Were we really, really sticking our necks out, or did we have evidence? And to be really clear, what we are saying is that this color painting of Cyanoseropteryx, which was the dinosaur we were studying, is wrong. We were saying this is wrong, and we know that it's wrong. Not we think it's wrong. And we were saying this is correct. And again, we were not saying I'm a professor, I'm telling you this is what it is. You'd better believe me because I'm a professor. We were saying we actually have evidence that we can show you. And the evidence comes from the feathers of modern birds. And so this, for example, is a zebrafinch, which is quite a well-known cage bird that many people keep. And we chose to look at the feathers of a zebrafinch because all of these colors that you see come from the pigment called melanin. Melanin is quite a well-known pigment. It's present in nearly all living things. It has many functions, not just as a pigment, it also has functions inside the body. So we have melanin in the brain, we have it in our liver, our spleen, many other organs of the body. But here I'm just concerned about the coloring function. And all the colors of the zebrafinch come from different forms of melanin. So there's one kind of melanin called eumelanin, which gives black and brown and blonde and even white colors, in the sense that if it's absent, you get white. But typically at full blast, eumelanin gives black. If it's less concentrated, it can give brown or gray. And if there's very little, but just a little, you can get blonde. And then this ginger color comes from pheomelanin, which is a different chemical type of melanin, related but different. And the extraordinary thing is, within even one feather, you can find these different colors from black to ginger to white. And looking at different parts of the feather at very high magnification, the ginger type of color comes from these spherical objects. So the feather, deep within the feather, within the structure of the feather, you see these ball-like structures. They're just about 1 micron in size, which is a millionth of a meter. Whereas in the eumelanin areas, the eumelanosomes are sausage-shaped. And so now you're beginning to maybe see how you can do this in the fossils. But let's just say another word about this before we go to the denouement. It's not just that the color and the shape match in the zebrafinch. And it's not even just that this relationship between color and shape is true for all birds, because that still wouldn't be enough to say this is surely then what happens in dinosaurs. It's the fact that in our hair as well, the hair of mammals, that color to shape relationship holds true. In other words, we can say this is a constant across vertebrates, that any vertebrate that's got any kind of whiskery structure growing in the skin, whether it's the hair of a mammal or the feather of a bird or the feather of a dinosaur or the feathery fibrous structure of a pterosaur, it doesn't matter. Almost certainly the color will have this relationship. Ginger to sphere, brown, black to sausage. That's the logic. So in a fossil, one of these remarkable fossils of Cyanoseropteryx from China, where you can see there are these simple whiskery, bristly structures along the back, and there are tufts along the tail. And notice the tufts, there's a sort of dark color, and then it's pale, dark and pale. And of course, by the way, there's black coloring in the eye. That's melanosomes in the retina of the eye. And there's also black coloring in the gut region. So these are probably internal melanosomes within the liver and other internal organs. So all this detail is there. And when we looked at melanosomes within these ancient feathers, first of all, they're preserved. That's great. One thing you need to know about melanin is it's a very tough molecule. After bone, this is one of the molecules, this is one of the biological structures that very commonly is preserved as a fossil. And not only is it preserved, but the melanosomes are there. So deep within the feathers, we go right inside. It's not on the outside of the feathers, deep within the structure of these simple feathery structures in this rather primitive theropod. We find that it's entirely packed with ball-shaped structures. Remember from the zebrafinch, these then indicate ginger color. Therefore, our reconstruction is ginger. And in the white areas, white, because there's no melanin. There are feathers there, but no melanin. So it's got this great barber's pole, ginger white striped tail. And the logic of the other group who studied their dinosaur was just the same. So we're arguing we have a string of evidence. We don't have a time machine. We know for sure that's what it looked like. If you want to test it, you can go and look at a different specimen of this particular dinosaur. You can use your own scanning electron microscope. You can analyze it yourself. Maybe you can disprove us. But then that's a characteristic of science. You don't have to believe me because I say it. You have to believe me because this is open to testing. And so far we've survived for 10 years. People have looked at other specimens, and thank goodness they've agreed with us. But at any time, somebody could come and disprove us by looking at another specimen. I would argue that's scientific because we have a line of reasoning. We don't have a time machine, but we don't need one. We have a line of reasoning. We can compare with modern forms and so on. So let me try and use that kind of argument in another case, which is to do with how fast could dinosaurs run? And in this case, some people will know the story. You can use footprints to calculate the speed. And this was noted quite a long time ago because people realized that the spacing of footprints is proportional to the speed that you're running. And this is an observation you can make if you think of yourself walking and running, or a horse or a dog. And there's a formula across the top here. I won't go through the detail of it, but this is an observational formula. And guess what? It always works. And if it always works for living animals, whether humans or rats or cats or dogs or horses, or ostriches, it doesn't matter whether you've got 2 legs or 4 legs, it always works. Therefore, why would it not work with a fossil form? And therefore, we can't say that this is the maximum speed, but we can say that for the walking of this particular dinosaur, notice the 3-toed footprint, here's the right foot, the left, the right, the left, the right, left, off it goes. You can calculate the stride length. We know the hip height from the size of the dinosaur. Gravity was the same in the Jurassic as it is today. You can calculate the speed. And not only do we have the opportunity in this case of calculating speed to test the formula, you keep testing it, test it on modern forms. It always works. You can actually cross-test as well, thanks to an observation by John Hutchinson, who is a paleontologist at the Royal Veterinary College near London. He realized there are other kinds of physical relationships between biological structures and speed. And without going into great detail, it's based on the common observation that athletes have got bigger leg muscles than non-athletes. So I've got very weedy little muscles in my leg and I can't run very fast, whereas an athlete's muscles are probably twice as thick as mine and they can run much faster. It may not be exactly one-to-one relationship, but obviously the bigger the muscles, the faster you can run. And John Hutchinson realized that you could calculate the sizes of the muscles of a whole variety of living creatures. And he chose the chicken as an example of a fast running bird. Now, you might not think a chicken runs very fast, but just you try to catch one. And they are pretty fast. And his idea was, what if you could take a chicken, which weighs about 0.5 kilogram, and scale it up to the size of TRex, which weighs about 5 tons. And so here's the 5-ton chicken. Could a 5-ton chicken, was his question, run proportionately as fast as a 0.5 kilogram chicken? And he realized it absolutely could not, because the proportion of the leg muscles would have to be absolutely huge, because the proportion of muscles is not proportional to the overall height of the animal, it's proportional to the body mass. And to make a 5-ton chicken run as relatively as fast as a regular sized chicken, the leg muscles would have to be absolutely huge, way beyond anything that is possible. And the same is true for T-Rex. Therefore, back calculating, he would say T-Rex could only effectively amble along at a kind of walking speed. And that confirms the calculations from the trackways. So what we've got here in the case of running speed is not only do we have two ways of looking at running speed, where you scale the dinosaur in proportion to living animals, and you can constantly cross-check all the time. Is this reasonable? Does this make sense in terms of what we know about modern organisms? You also have the chance to corroborate your estimated speeds, because you can do an independent calculation of running speed of T-Rex based upon trackways, and then based upon calculations of the muscle sizes, which you get from estimating the positioning of the muscles on the skeleton, et cetera, because of course the muscles in the hind leg of T-Rex were exactly the same as in the hind leg of a chicken, and indeed ourselves. There's a great constancy. We all have got the same leg muscles. And here's another example I'll just talk you through very briefly. The same has been done for bite force. So the first observation was you can find pieces of bone. I don't think I've illustrated that here. Pieces of bone which have been bitten by T-Rex, and you know that because you can take a mold of the tooth mark in the bone, and you can take out the molded specimen, and you know it's a T-Rex tooth. And then you can do experiments, and you ask a question of what force is required to drive a T-Rex tooth 3 or 4 centimeters into the bone of a triceratops, and you get a certain calculation of force, 10 or 20,000 newtons. And you can also do calculations based on digital models, 3D models in the computer, where you reconstruct the model like shown here. The white is the bone of the T-Rex skull. And you can give that skull the physical properties of bone, not plastic or steel or wood or anything else. The great power of the computer model is that you can replicate the properties of bone. How do we know the properties of the T-Rex bone? I mean, this is the property of how much it can bend under compression, how brittle it is if you twist it and turn it, all of that. Because of course its bone has got the same properties of bone of living creatures like crocodiles or cows or indeed humans. And so we don't give them miraculous properties, because of course we understand that the bone of these animals is essentially the same in material properties of modern bone. And so Bates and Falkingham did some calculations of bite force of T-Rex. Here they are, thousands of newtons. And here they are compared to the great white shark, the lion, and the human. And so our bite force range is puny compared to the T-Rex. This is tons. This is something like 5 tons. You convert newtons to tons, roughly 10,000 newtons is a ton. So whereas the great white shark can exert about a ton of force on you, T-Rex could exert about 5 tons. Humans, it's just a tiny fraction of a ton. This can be cross-checked, and we can be confident about the digital method, because these methods have been applied particularly by my colleague Emily Rayfield at the University of Bristol. And she pioneered these methods with TRex. Here's the skull. You turn the skull into a network like this within the computer. You apply specific material properties to each of these elements or cells in the network. So you're not just giving the whole skull a particular material property. You're assuming, for example, that the teeth will have different material properties from bone. They'll be maybe harder, maybe more brittle, less able to bend. And then different regions of the skull, we know, because we can take X-ray scans and you can look at how porous the bone is. Is it compact? Is it open and porous? And then you compare with modern bone and you can apply these different properties. And then once you've done all of that mapping, and when she did this initially in her PhD, it took ages and ages because the software was very clunky. You can then apply forces as shown here, and this shows you the stresses. Red is high stress, blue is low stress, and you can calculate with different kinds of forces, one up here, one here, how the skull responds. Now, big question, do we believe all of this? My question to you is, have you ever been in a modern skyscraper or an aeroplane? If you have, you believe FEA works, because in the design of skyscrapers and aircraft, the engineers have been using FEA methods for decades, since after the Second World War. These are the key methods that they use to test the safety. And therefore, if you trust yourself in an airplane in normal times, you trust that it works. Therefore, I would declare it works for dinosaurs as well. So what is science? Hypotheses should be testable. We can't repeat things, but we have this great benefit down at the bottom here of corroboration and ground truthing. So I'm just sort of wrapping up this key point on, should we believe what we read? My argument is, if the work has been done in the way I've shown for determining color, for determining running speed, for determining bite force, and then of course, blending all of those individual studies together, for example, in Martin Sanders' study to understand how dinosaurs could be huge, I would argue that each of these steps along the way is supported by evidence. And this is then a million miles away from what some of you might have thought, that what you read in the book is just a kind of pipe dream by somebody who thinks they know a lot. They've read a lot of Wikipedia. They kind of put it all together. No, I want you to know, behind these more modern studies of all of these aspects of paleobiology is this kind of chain of evidence. And it's equally true for people who talk about ammonites or fossil crabs or fish or plants. There are these kinds of physical paleobiological studies being done. And I would give them great merit, great value, because they are a million miles away from pure speculation. And there is a word for this in geology that might be familiar to certain people, which is uniformitarianism. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the uniform thing is part of it, the key part. We assume that the rules of nature, the laws of physics, the nature of the earth hasn't changed, that in the Jurassic it's more or less the same as it is today. And this is the basis, as many know, of course, behind geology. We look at modern beaches and rivers and deserts to try to understand what the ancient environments might have been like. And this is a standard principle. And uniformitarianism is why we assume that the gravity in the Jurassic was the same, that the physical properties of bones were the same, etc., etc. And now I'm not going to go into great detail on the remaining slides. I'm just going to touch on these fairly briefly, but there's more in the book. I have a whole chapter about each of these, and there's a really secure body of science behind each of these. So when you look at this kind of growth rate diagram for T-Rex, we can say that T-Rex would reach a certain size, 5 to 6 tons, that it maybe reached that body mass at the age of 20 to 25, and that they were probably sexually mature halfway there at maybe 2 or 3 tons at an age of maybe 15 to 17. So looking at a growth curve like that, that looks like a big, big guess. But I can reassure you, it's based upon evidence of growth rings in the bone, estimates of body mass based upon a variety of different ways of estimating mass from skeletons. Origin of dinosaurs, of course, this depends largely, to a large extent, on the discovery of fossils. So our understanding has changed a lot. Here is the Triassic, the early Triassic, late Triassic. Here are the early dinosaurs shown in blue. The oldest fossils of dinosaurs, the oldest confident fossils of dinosaurs are late Carnian, something like 230 million years ago. And yet we now say that we know for a fact that dinosaurs actually originated in the early Triassic. So this is a lovely fact for young people to be aware of, that there are maybe 20 million years of missing fossil record. Go out there, find these early dinosaurs. You will get famous, because any really old dinosaur within this gap, how do we know that? The nearest cousins of dinosaurs are the Silosaurids. They look very like dinosaurs, but they're not quite. And indeed, they date back, right back to this point. And this is confirmed by early discoveries here and here. So without looking at the names, we don't need to worry so much. But the pterosaurs as well, if anything, the oldest pterosaurs are even younger. They're Norian, maybe something like 225 or 220 million years ago. So the gap back to the origin of pterosaurs is huge. And we'd all love to find some of these missing pre-flying creatures, because by the time you get up to here, they are fully blown pterosaurs. They can fully fly, and they're not that different from later forms. So we know a lot more than we did. And I've marked on various extinction events, and some of you may be aware of the recent studies, which I don't have time to talk about, that in fact, dinosaurs had originated very early, just after a big mass extinction here, but they didn't do very much. They were quite rare. Until this point, when the Carnian pluvial event happened, which is a mystery extinction event that, if you're not aware of it, it's very much under study at the moment. And then a lot of aspects of dinosaur evolution were further affected by the end Triassic mass extinction. People are also looking at the effects of the origin of flowers in the middle of the Cretaceous. It had a big effect on modern life. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, kind of exploded on the scene and boosted up in numbers in various steps through the Cretaceous and subsequently. And that created habitats for so much of modern life. Beetles and wasps and bees and ants and butterflies and ordinary flies. They were all around before the flowering plants, and they exploded in diversity as a result of that. And then insect-eating amphibians and lizards and birds and mammals. But curiously, the dinosaurs didn't seem to be much affected by this. So this lovely painting of a TRex looking at a magnolia tree and thinking, what the heck is that? You know, it's an indication of the modern world, but somehow it kind of passed the dinosaurs by. The extinction of the dinosaurs, of course, we always end with that. And again, that's a whole lecture, which I shan't go into. We know that this single event, this massive impact, and a lot of recent papers published in 2020 have really confirmed, thanks to really high quality dating, that it was not the Deccan traps. It was very much this impact that actually caused the final end of the dinosaurs. And yet we have argued from computational studies, which I only illustrate very briefly here, that very likely the main lines of dinosaurs were already leveling off, and if anything, declining to some extent, that they'd kind of run out of evolutionary vigor by that time, maybe as a result of cooling climates or some other changes that were already going on in the late Cretaceous. So I'll end with this slide that our knowledge of dinosaurs, of the paleobiology of dinosaurs, how they lived, how they functioned, has just undergone the most enormous revolution in the last 20 years, partly thanks to astonishing new fossils from China, mainly because of fantastic new technical ways of studying these extraordinary fossils. And then secondly, because of the new fossils and improvements in geology, far better possibility of dating the rocks, better ways of analyzing ancient climates. We have a very much richer understanding of how dinosaurs evolved as well. So I think that's my last slide, and I'm going to stop share there, so I will be on your screen, for which I apologize, and I'm very happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Michael. Do you know what? That's probably the best hour I've spent on as a Sunday for many a year. So thank you very, very much. It's really entertaining, very informative, and I think everyone agree that was wonderful. Yes, guys, we've got about 9 minutes until this call ends, I'm afraid. So we do have some time for some questions. If you'd like to put your question into the chat box, then we can get those answered for you. And if you're looking at the stream on Facebook, if you can put that in the comments, please. Michael, we have got a question from Bjorn. He said, I noticed the Jurassic Park size chart in the beginning of the presentation. Do you think Jurassic Park is a blessing or a curse for the scientific community? You're thinking about, how dinosaurs are portrayed.
That's a great question. And I think on the whole, it's a blessing. I mean, I think they've let it go, sadly, because when the first Jurassic Park came out in 1993, it was reputed that there was a huge consultation exercise where they spoke to lots of paleontologists and they got a lot of advice, and that they were able to make a case that not only is this amazing new kinds of animation, because at that time, that was virtually the first kind of CGI, serious use of CGI in a big movie. And of course, famously, the BBC took off and did their Walking with Dinosaurs 1997, which was all CGI, highly scientific. Sadly, the later ones, as we all know, are not, because they didn't keep pace with discovery. And we've complained many times, why don't you show these dinosaurs with their fantastic feathers, which we know many of them had. And they more or less said, we don't want to show T-Rex with feathers. It would just look like an overgrown chicken, and then it's not very scary.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Bjorn had a follow-up question with that. How difficult is it for a scientist to see paleo art that's so obviously wrong?
Yes, I think most paleo artists are very keen to get it right. And we have some fantastic practitioners in this country, some of whose artworks I've used. And I apologize in certain cases that I was not acknowledging the artwork, and I won't name names now because that would be invidious. But there are very many professional paleo artists also in other countries who really, really want to get the images right. And the artists have been massively excited by all of this revolution that I've talked about, because this provides such wonderful material to revise the artworks. And indeed, in many cases, such as these feathered small theropods and Colindodromeus and so on, to produce startlingly new artworks that really, really excite people. And so seeing tired old artworks where the animals are maybe standing inappropriately, meaning not very well balanced, the old-fashioned kangaroo type posture, or certainly where we know evidence of feathers where they're just not showing feathers, and you think, for goodness sake, we know that, and then that can be quite disappointing. But I think overall, because this revolution has gone through the public consciousness and is massively adopted by professional, commercial, and amateur paleo artists, I think it's a very exciting time.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your questions, Bjorn. Francesco would like to know, how did the scales become feathers? She said, really interesting tool. Thank you very much.
Yes. So we've always assumed that scales and feathers and hairs are essentially the same structures, homologous, as we would call them technically. And the evidence for that is massive. And it's not just the anatomy. The fact, for example, that a mammal hair comes out of a follicle in the skin, a sort of structure, just as a bird feather. But chemically, they're the same. They're made of the protein keratin. They all contain melanosomes. So the color is transmitted into these structures in the same way, and in pterosaurs. So technically, pterosaur whiskers have often been called pycnofibers. We would just call them feathers and be done with it. But also they have melanosomes as well. So we know these structures. And now we know that the genomic pathways, the molecular evidence is that they are all the same. And that the scales of reptiles and the scales of fishes are also the same. So we see some suggestions, and I think scales have evolved into feathers several times. And in Colindodromeus, for example, we see that the feathers there, if you remember, they were sort of shield-shaped structures in regular rows, just like scales, in sort of diamond-shaped offset rows. But they had sort of trailers of keratin banners kind of flying behind. And of course, when you look at certain lizard scales, some of them have kind of frilly scales. So I think it seems to be relatively easy for a keratin scale to become a keratin whisker, just by becoming frilly in some way. And very likely in dinosaurs and in pterosaurs, it may be that these different kinds of feather type structures emerge multiple times.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Francesca, for your question there. It looks like it, and we've got only a couple of minutes to go, so I'm going to wrap this up and say thank you so much, Michael. Honestly, it's really been absolutely fascinating. I could listen to you for ages. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. We've got one more chat after this at 2:15. But in the meantime, thank you so much, and goodbye. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Bye-bye.